to God, I did not know that. I did not know that there was that many papers published from the start of the pandemic to August 2021. That is incredible. Alrighty, I'm back again, and I got something interesting to talk with y'all in light of the president's speech this afternoon, in which he kept reiterating this stupid nonsense of following the science, which, if you all know me on this channel, you know I hate that phrase, passionately so. Anyhoozle, before we get started, though, I just want to remind you all, of course, to jump over, if you want to connect with me and other scientists and science enthusiasts, head on over to SciWorthy.locals.com and join the SciWorthy community. You can join as a member for free, but you can also, if you pay and become a supporter, you also get the opportunity to post yourself, to comment, to ask questions, to see the exclusive for supporters SciWorthy Conversations, where Gina and I talk on all sorts of issues in science going on. We had a fun one recently on the whole alarmism issue and working through a particular article about that. And so that's there, and that's as low as $3 a month, but you can also become a member for free and just lurk for a little bit, but you won't be able to comment and you won't be able to see certain things that are up there. So that in mind, make sure you jump on over and support SciWorthy.locals.com. If you are becoming a supporter, the SciWorthy folks, thank you. I actually don't get any money off of that. Myself, I just think they're a good group of people who do nonpartisan science journalism. And so if you are supporting SciWorthy on Locals, you are supporting nonpartisan science journalism, and we need more of it. Okay, on to the article at hand. So I noticed something that crossed my radar in Tablet magazine, of all places, and written by Professor John Ioannidis. I'm sorry, Professor, if I mispronounced your name. I honestly don't know how to pronounce that. Professor Ioannidis, may just call him John, Professor of Medicine and Professor of Epidemiology and Population Health, as well as Professor by courtesy of Biomedical Science and Statistics at Stanford University. His complete COVID-19 related publications can be found here. And I think it might be his first appearance in Tablet magazine with this new piece here, How the Pandemic is Changing the Norms of Science. And so that's actually what I want to get into. It was an interesting piece when it crossed my radar. I haven't read it all the way through, so this is going to be a little bit of a fresh reaction as we read through some of this. But I think it's an interesting thought that maybe the pandemic has changed the norms of science. Here, so let us begin. How the pandemic is changing the norms of science. Imperatives like skepticism and disinterestedness are being junked to fuel political warfare that has nothing in common with scientific methodology. Okay, we might be interesting there. In the past, I had often fervently wished that one day everyone would be passionate and excited about scientific research. I should have been more careful about what I wished for. The crisis caused by the lethal COVID-19 pandemic and by the responses to the crisis have made billions of people worldwide acutely interested and overexcited about science. Decisions pronounced in the name of science have become arbitrators of life, death, and fundamental freedoms. Everything that mattered was affected by science, by scientists interpreting science, and by those who impose measures based on their interpretations of science in the context of political warfare. Yeah, it is interesting. Science does have an important place in society, and, I always hope that myself, people get excited about science research, not just me as a scientist and what I do. And indeed, be careful what you wish for. One problem with this new mass engagement with science is that most people, including most people in the West, had never been seriously exposed to the fundamental norms of the scientific method. The Mertonian norms of communality, in universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism have unfortunately never been mainstream in education, media, or even in science museums and TV documentaries on scientific topics. This is true. This is very true. If you notice where I covered in the video, Critical Race Theory is Anti-Science, I talked about this. I am a PhD scientist. I got my PhD in 2016. I did not know what these norms were and was not taught them through my entire college career. I learned them after the fact, after I got my PhD, when I started just exploring and reading on my own. They were not taught, and yet nowadays they're demonized. Before the pandemic, the sharing of data, protocols, and discoveries for free was limited, comprising the communalism on which the scientific method is based. It was already widely tolerated that science was not universal, but the realm of an ever more hierarchical elite, a minority of experts. Gargantuan financial and other interests and conflicts thrived in the neighborhood of science, and the norm of disinterestedness was left forlorn. As for organized skepticism, it did not sell well within academic sanctuaries. Even the best peer-reviewed journals often presented results with bias and spin. Broader public and media dissemination of scientific discoveries was largely focused on what could be exaggerated about the research rather than the rigor of its methods and the inherent uncertainty of the results. Unfortunately, as much as we really want these norms to be the most important thing, John here points out very accurately and astutely that we do quite often fail at some of those important things. And in particular, communality is not the most... communality is definitely not considered there. There's a certain amount of... no, not communality so much. I mean, peer review is out there and we get it out there to each other, but communality is the idea that knowledge is open to all. Scientific knowledge belongs to all. Universalism is also there in that, everybody can do science, and yet we assign it all the more often to an elite group of people. And that you should not judge people based on race, sex, gender, what have you, professional affiliations even, when it comes to universalism. And yet, that seems to be what happened. Disinterestedness is a problem, and admittedly, that does go to the issue of who pays the bills for doing science in the U.S. in particular. So you think of funding agencies with the government, and the government sets the agenda for what science they want to pay for, and that's how you get your research done sometimes if you're relying on government grants. Foundations also pay for some research, and they have their specific priorities of things they want researched. Generally, there's still the rule of you let people do whatever research they want to do and whatever conclusion comes up. Although sometimes it's not the conclusion that the funding agency necessarily wants to hear. That's not what's supposed to matter in this. So, I mean, I do understand where he's coming from with this. I mean, I try very hard to stick to those norms myself, particularly now that I know them and now that I understand particularly why they were always something that really called to me as an important norm of science, but not necessarily true of all of science as an institution. Let's put it that way. Science as a philosophy, as an approach, is a good thing, but science as an institution does have problems. As for organized skepticism, it did not sell very well. Yeah, you're presenting results with bias and spin. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to focus on, the rigor of the methods and how well the methods were done and, how well the arguments presented, not whether or not it could favor a narrative, is the point he's getting at here. Nevertheless, despite the cynical realization that the methodological norms of science had been neglected, or perhaps because of this realization, voices struggling for more communalism, universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism had been multiplying among scientific circles prior to the pandemic. Reformers were often seen as holding some sort of moral high ground despite being outnumbered in occupancy of powerful positions. Reproducibility crises in many scientific fields, ranging from biomedicine to psychology, cause soul-searching and efforts to enhance transparency, including the sharing of raw data, protocols, and code. Inequalities within the academy were increasingly recognized with calls to remedy them. Many were receptive to pleas for reform. And this is true. I mean, Peter Boghossian might be a good example of someone who would have done this. There are other scientists who have recognized these problems exist and written about reproducibility crises, and admittedly, some very good scientists are getting very, very rigorous in pointing out this is bad science that's being produced because they're not checking it, and even though it fits a narrative, doesn't make it a good thing. Opinion-based experts, while still dominant in influential committees, professional societies, major conferences, funding bodies, and other power nodes of the system, were often challenged by evidence-based criticism. There were efforts to make conflicts of interest more transparent and to minimize their impact, even if most science leaders remain conflicted, especially in medicine. a thriving community of scientists focused on rigorous methods, understanding biases, and minimizing their impact. The field of meta-research, research on research, had become widely respected. One might therefore have hoped that the pandemic crisis could have fostered change. Indeed, change did happen, but perhaps mostly for the worse. So, yeah, there's what he's talking about here with meta-research. That is research on how research is done. Some of it might be also referred to as like philosophy of science or sociology, scientific sociology or something like that. Something that works on the social structures of how we do science. That kind of research does go on. And there's a lot of interesting like meta discussions on the scientific method and how it's changed. And, does one method work for all the different types of science that now exist? Be it climate science or psychology. Does that same method hold for each one? Some would argue, no, the method needs to be unique for each field, and others would argue, no, one common method is great. So that's an interesting argument in sort of the meta research kind of section, which I've noticed in the last few years in particular that's happening. So there's that. Lack of communalism during the pandemic fueled scandals and conspiracy theories, which were then treated as fact in the name of science by much of the popular press and on social media. The retraction of a highly visible YouTube, I am just reading this. I am not expressing anything related to medical information. I am not a doctor. I am not encouraging anything like that. I'm just reading this. The retraction of a highly visible hydroxychloroquine paper from The Lancet was a startling example. A lack of sharing and openness allowed a top medical journal to publish an article in which 671 hospitals allegedly contributed data that did not exist, and no one noticed this outright fabrication before publication. The New England Journal of Medicine, another top journal, managed to publish a similar paper. Many scientists continue to heavily cite it long after its retraction. Yes, this is the kind of problem with the lack of openness and transparency that is required by the norm of communalism. This is the kind of thing that happens, is there's secrecy. You can't replicate results. There's problems that come, and scandals like this then happen. And if they're not found out, then it's even worse, because it goes on and gets cited. It's a good paper, and good research and what have you. And it contributes to problems down the line, because the thing about science is it builds on each other. They build on each other with different studies. We cite studies in the past as either, well, no, this study had a problem, or this study was great, and we're going to look at another aspect of it over here, and all this kind of thing. So if one study is really shitty and really shittily done because it wasn't transparent, and there wasn't openness and access to everything, this is the kind of stuff that can happen. The hottest public scientific debate of the moment, whether the COVID-19 virus was the product of natural evolution or a laboratory accident, could have been settled easily with a minimal demonstration of communalism. It was originally called communism, but communalism is better because communism is an awful form of government. Anyway, from China, opening the lab books of the Wuhan Institute of Virology would have alleviated concerns immediately. Without such openness about which experiments were done, lab leak theories remain tantalizingly credible. Personally, I don't want to consider the lab leak theory a major blow to scientific investigation as the dominant explanation yet. I respect his opinion. I have my own thoughts on that, which I'm not going to get into here. However, if full public data sharing cannot happen even for a question relevant to the deaths of millions and the suffering of billions, what hope is there for scientific transparency and a sharing culture? Whatever the origins of the virus, the refusal to abide by formally accepted norms has done its own damage. He's actually making an extremely good point. Had there been a lot of openness about this from the jump from the scientists in different parts of the world, and particularly in China, we wouldn't have a lot of these problems. We wouldn't be asking a lot of these questions right now. A lot of conspiracy theories would have been shot down. There probably wouldn't be an awful lot of distrust with respect to the government, because openness is important. Poll after poll after poll after poll shows this with respect to the different public agencies, and also with respect to different peer-reviewed papers where I've seen this. Being open, being transparent inherently increases trust in the results. In the results of a study or in the results of the output. Being transparent, being able to say, which Fauci never does, I think, being able to put out a mea culpa and say, I'm sorry, I screwed it up. This is what we thought before and why we thought it. This is what we think now and why we think it now. Having those mea culpas in there, which never seem to happen lately, that increases trust, and it's not happening. He's making a very good point. A lot of stuff that we have problems with now would have been alleviated had we stuck to the idea of leaving things open and honest. Let's continue. The pandemic led seemingly overnight to a scary new form of scientific universalism. Everyone did COVID-19 science or commented on it. By August 2021, 330,000 scientific papers were published on COVID-19 involving roughly 1 million different authors. An analysis showed that scientists from every single one of the 174 disciplines that comprise what we know as science has published on COVID-19. By the end of 2020, only automobile engineering didn't have scientists publishing on COVID-19. By early 2021, the automobile engineers had their say too. What? Honest to God, I did not know that. I did not know that there was that many papers published from the start of the pandemic to August 2021. That is incredible. I'd imagine there's some climate scientists who's published on COVID-19 and I just haven't seen it. That's incredible. That's not the right kind of universalism that we're talking about here. At first sight, this was an unprecedented mobilization of interdisciplinary talent. However, most of this work was low quality, often wrong, and sometimes highly misleading. Many people without subject matter technical expertise became experts overnight, emphatically saving the world. Save the world mentality isn't a good mentality. As these spurious experts multiplied, evidence-based approaches like randomized trials and collection of more accurate, unbiased data were frequently dismissed as inappropriate, too slow, and harmful. The disdain for reliable study designs was even celebrated. I didn't know about that, although he doesn't have a reference here, so I would ask, John, can you give me a reference for that? I'm just curious. I actually agree in the sense that okay, I can approach this from my own expertise as a climate scientist. I am an expert in climate modeling in particular. I have seen numerous studies get done where, in particular, there was no one with my expertise or climate science background in as part of the group of authors, and they used climate projections and the output from climate models for something like hydrology, ecology, agriculture outputs, any number of different things like that. And I looked at it, I looked at how they used the data, and I was like, thinking to myself, that's crap, because you can't use the projections that way. They're not designed to do that, and you use projections that are enabled to do that. So there's a bunch of studies like that I know of that I'm just like, what the fuck were you doing that you used the study that way? So, yeah, I understand where he's coming from there. Climate change is the same thing in that there's been a lot of interdisciplinary mobilization. And a lot of that is good because, when we're talking about the climate touches on everything. So you do need to think about, how is climate change going to impact this and this and this and this and this. So there's a lot of avenue for interdisciplinary scientific questions to unfold. COVID, to a degree, I can understand that too. But he's right. People who don't have actually subject matter technical expertise in medicine somehow are now overnight when that's not what they were trained in originally. So yeah, I can understand what he's getting at. Some of the interdisciplinary stuff is needed, quite possibly with COVID-19 if it and going on, but that doesn't diminish, some subject matter experts, some people who are trying to be subject matter experts in something that they are not an expert in at that point. Many amazing scientists have worked in COVID-19. I admire their work. Their contributions have taught us so much. My gratitude extends to the many extremely talented and well-trained young investigators who rejuvenate our aging scientific workforce. However, alongside thousands of solid scientists came freshly minted experts with questionable, irrelevant, or non-existent credentials and questionable, irrelevant, or non-existent data. Social and mainstream media have helped to manufacture this new breed of experts. Anyone who is not an epidemiologist or health policy specialist could suddenly be cited as an epidemiologist or health policy specialist by reporters who often knew little about these fields, but immediately knew which opinions were true. Conversely, some of the best epidemiologists and health policy specialists in America were smeared as clueless and dangerous by people who believed themselves fit to summarily arbitrate the differences of scientific opinion without understanding the methodology or data at issue. Yeah, this is something to consider right here, in that, I deal with this in a way, social media, and people think they're experts in climate science when they're not. And this happens both right and left. I will give it that. There are folks on the right who don't know shit and try and say otherwise, and others on the left who make extremely wild, alarmistic claims and also don't know what they're talking about. So yes, I understand that. Disinterestedness suffered gravely. In the past, conflicted entities mostly tried to hide their agendas. During the pandemic, these same conflicted entities were raised to the status of heroes. For example, big pharma companies clearly produced useful drugs, vaccines, and other interventions that saved lives, though it was also known that profit was their main motive. Is their main motive. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. A company does exist to make profit and develop and grow. That's not the issue here. It's the point of when with big pharma and things like that. If it all becomes about money, then it's an issue. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that statement of them going after a profit. They are a company. Big tobacco was known to kill millions of people every year and to continuously mislead when promoting its old and new equally harmful products. Yet during the pandemic, requesting better evidence on effectiveness and adverse events was often considered an anathema. Yeah, this dismissive authoritarian approach, quote, in defense of science, may sadly have enhanced vaccine hesitancy and the anti-vax movement, wasting a unique opportunity that was created by the fantastic rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines. Even the tobacco industry upgraded its reputation. Philip Morris donated ventilators to propel a profile of corporate responsibility and saving lives, a tiny fraction of which were put at risk of death from COVID-19 because of background diseases caused by tobacco products. The dismissive authoritarian approach, if you watch the panel chat I did a while back with a group of people, it's one of the things I talked about is if you're just... They were completely turned off as a group, and I've seen this with other conversations with others too, completely turned off as a group by the authoritarian. You must do this because science says so. You must do this because science says so. And it's for a couple of reasons. It's for one, like, you're treating me like a 2-year-old. Why can't you talk to me and explain it to me and answer my question? They hate that. A lot of people hate that. I hate that myself. And, it's the arrogance of it. You're looking down on me. You don't care about me. You have arrogance. You say you are this expert and therefore I have to believe you. And yeah, so I would not be surprised that some of this has caused a lot of vaccine hesitancy in here. Asking for better evidence, asking for more information on effectiveness and any adverse effects and what have you. That's the thing. And I will say with respect to COVID is talk to your doctor. Talk to your doctor. If the vaccine's right for you, go for it. That's my thing. And that's between you and your doctor. That is entirely between you and your doctor. That is the only little bit I'm saying is it's between you and your doctor to decide what kind of, whether or not you can get the vaccine, or if you have a condition like GBS or what have you where you can't, and figuring out how to mitigate the risk of COVID when you have that particular condition, or any other kinds of conditions where you just can't get a vaccine because it might trigger your symptoms of GBS. Anyway, things like that. Talk to your doctor is all I can give you. Talk to your doctor about it. Other potentially conflicted entities became the new societal regulators rather than the ones being regulated. Big tech companies, which gained trillions of dollars in cumulative market value from the virtual transformation of human life during lockdown, developed powerful censorship machineries that skewed the information available to users on their platforms. Consultants who made millions of dollars from corporate and government consultation were given prestigious positions, power, and public praise, while unconflicted scientists who worked pro bono but dared to question dominant narratives were smeared as being conflicted. Organized skepticism was seen as a threat to public health. There was a clash between two schools of thought, authoritarian public health versus science, and science lost. Yeah, I don't think I can add much to that. It's definitely what it feels like lately, and I think that's what it feels like to a lot of people. Though I'm sure, hey, if you disagree, comment. I want to hear it. Honest, continued questioning and exploration of alternative paths are indispensable for good science. Yes. 100%, absolutely yes. You must have continued questioning, poking, prodding. I said this the other day when I talked about Peter Boghossian's resignation. He's exactly right. This author is exactly right. You must be able to continue to poke and prod and what have you from different directions. Figure out if something's the truth. Figure out alternative perspectives. What is the truth about an answer to a question? You got to figure that out. In the authoritarian, as opposed to participatory version of public health, these activities were seen as treason and desertion. The dominant narrative became that, quote, we are at war. When at war, everyone has to follow orders. If a platoon is ordered to go right and some soldiers explore maneuvering to the left, they are shot as deserters. Scientific skepticism had to be shot, no questions asked. The orders were clear. Who gave those orders? Who gave these orders? Who decided that his or her opinion, expertise, and conflicts should be in charge? It was not a single person, not a crazy general or a despicable politician or a dictator, even if political interference in science did happen, massively so. It was all of us, a conglomerate that has no name and no face, a mesh and a mess of half-cooked evidence, frenzied and partisan media promoting parachute journalism and pack coverage, the proliferation of pseudonymous and eponymous social media personas, which led even serious scientists to become unrestrained, wild beast avatars of themselves, spitting massive quantities of inanity and nonsense, poorly regulated industry and technology companies flexing their brain and marketing power, and common people afflicted by the protracted crisis. All swim in a mixture of some good intentions, some excellent thinking, and some splendid scientific successes, but also of conflicts, political polarization, fear, panic, hatred, divisiveness, fake news, censorship, inequalities, racism, and chronic and acute social dysfunction. Holy mackerel, that's a mouthful, that paragraph. I don't know what I entirely think of that whole paragraph, but I do think there's been this sort of unfortunate push toward some dependency, push towards some level of dependency where, you're dependent upon others to help you figure out your life or how to live your life or what have you. And that usually ends pretty badly for yourself as an individual, but also, for society as a whole. You're more dependent on the government, usually ends up more spending, more inflation. We know where this goes. This is in the history books already. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I can imagine there was a lot of good things, and there's a lot of good intentions for a lot of things. Usually it is never a bunch of people starting with evil intentions. There's always some good intentions there, but having power corrupts absolutely. And I do think I've done a lot to try and avoid this myself, because I honestly don't like being in power. I don't think power is the most important thing. I think the truth is. But having suddenly, I wonder if scientists having suddenly a lot of power vested in them in terms of their opinion being so valuable that thousands or maybe millions of people will now make decisions about their daily lives based upon the opinion of a scientist or scientists. It's like absolute power corrupts absolutely. You know what I mean? Suddenly having so much power makes people think, oh, I've got all this power, so I can do really good things. I can get the world to be great. I can get the world to be amazing. Problem with that kind of mentality is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You may have good intentions for whatever power you have, but having that much power ultimately means that something horrible is going to happen. Time and time again, we see this. It was Mao Zedong's China, Stalin, Lenin, Pol Pot, Hitler, you name it. Go down the list of how much people were given absolute power and how awful it went. And scientists are not immune from that. I've said that many times. Practicing science and practicing the norms of science does not make you immune as to the failings of human nature, really, to being tempted to do things that are pretty evil, for that matter. And so it's something I got to point out here. He's got it right. He's got it right here that I think there's an awful lot of all of this. Actually, I do agree. And I do also think too that scientists are human, and we do have our serious biases ourselves. No practicing of science gives you wisdom. No practicing of science makes you immune to the failings of the human heart. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. there has to be the people willing to stand up and practice skepticism, practice the organized skepticism to challenge what is dominant narratives. And as I said the other day, I don't even mind seeing the people who are skeptical of climate change being human caused and seeing them come in and talk about it. I don't mind that. As long as you're civil with me, I'll be civil with you. Totally fine. If you're going to yell and scream at me, that's a different thing. But there's that. And, you know, we need people to continue to challenge scientific consensus. To have scientific skepticism always be there. It should always be there. Heated but healthy scientific debates are welcome. Serious critics are our greatest benefactors. John Tukey once said that the collective noun for a group of statisticians is a quarrel. I like that too. This applies to other scientists. I like that. This applies to other scientists too. But we are at war led to a step beyond. This is a dirty war, one without dignity. Opponents were threatened, abused, and bullied by cancel culture campaigns in social media, hit stories on mainstream media, and bestsellers written by zealots. Statements were distorted, turned into straw men, and ridiculed. Wikipedia pages were vandalized. Reputations were systematically devastated and destroyed. Many brilliant scientists were abused and received threats during the pandemic intended to make them and their families miserable. Anonymous and pseudo-anonymous abuse has a chilling effect. It is worse when the people doing the abusing are eponymous and respectable. The only viable response to bigotry and hypocrisy are kindness, civility, empathy, and dignity. However, barring in-person communication, virtual living, and social media in social isolation are poor conveyors of these virtues. And yeah, one thing I would add to that is it's a lot easier. Twitter's a damn good example of this, actually. It's a lot easier to attack somebody online because that's a persona. That's not a person right in front of you. And you can still have, don't get me wrong, you can still start attacking people when they're right in front of you. But attacking a persona that's built up online is a lot easier to do than attacking a person that you've gotten, and particularly one that you've gotten to know when you understand why they think the way they do. Yeah. And so I can understand what he's saying here. I would add that to his thing here. It's like virtual media and social, poor conveyors of doing things with kindness, civility, empathy, and dignity. Politics had a deleterious influence on pandemic science. Anything an apolitical scientist said or wrote could be weaponized for political agendas. This is really true of any field, and I would add climate science sometimes has this problem too. Trying public health interventions like masks and vaccines to a faction, tying public health interventions like masks and vaccines to a faction, political or otherwise, satisfies those devoted to that faction, but infuriates the opposing faction. I'm going to say the president did this before. When he vilified people who haven't gotten the vaccine in his speech, he convinced nobody with that speech earlier today. This process undermines the wider adoption required for such interventions to be effective. Politics dressed up as public health not only injured science, it also shot down participatory public health where people are empowered rather than obligated and humiliated. And this is the thing. I have said this so many times on this channel. You can go all the way back through to, I think it was the elitism versus empathy kind of thing. If you are demeaning people, if you are humiliating people, or if you're making it an obligation to them, and you are doing this as a scientist, congratulations, you're an elitist ass, and nobody's going to trust you. I'm sorry, that's just the way I think about it that way, and I get so annoyed when a lot of scientists just don't realize it. They think they have the right to force this down somebody's throat. No, you do not. You have to empower people. You have to get people to want to do certain things. You have to convince people. And sometimes, sometimes you're not going to succeed in doing that. And I'm sorry, freedom doesn't take a holiday just because you're upset about it. Just because you're upset that somebody wouldn't do something that you recommended. Freedom doesn't take a holiday. I'm sorry. A scientist cannot and should not try to change his or her data and inferences based on the current doctrine of political parties or the reading du jour of the social media thermometer. In an environment where traditional political divisions between right and left no longer seem to make much sense, data, sentences, and interpretations are taken out of context and weaponized. The same apolitical scientist could be attacked by left-wing commentators in one place and by alt-right commentators in another. Yes, actually, this I know does happen. Not just to scientists. This happens to people who who for some reason, think some people think they're conservatives when they're not. And so the conservatives are like, you were never conservative and all this. This happens all the time at this point. Let's see. Many excellent scientists had to silence themselves in this chaos. Their self-censorship has been a major loss for scientific investigation and the public health effort. My heroes are the many well-intentioned scientists who were abused, smeared, and threatened during the pandemic. I respect all of them and suffer for what they went through, regardless of whether their scientific positions agreed or disagreed with mine. I suffer for and cherish even more those whose positions disagreed with mine. There was absolutely no conspiracy or pre-planning behind this hypercharged evolution. Simply, in times of crisis, the powerful thrive and the weak become more disadvantaged. Amid pandemic confusion, the powerful and the conflicted become more powerful and more conflicted, while millions of disadvantaged people have died and billions have suffered. I worry that science and its norms have shared the fate of the disadvantaged. It is a pity because science can still help everyone. Science remains the best thing that can happen to humans, provided it can be both tolerant and tolerated. Bravo, John. I'm not going to try and pronounce your last name because I'm going to butcher it. I already tried once and I'm pretty sure I butchered it, but thank you. This is a good piece. This is again one that I tend to disagree with, and I'm probably going to end up reading a couple of others that I don't. YouTube, again, I'm just reading the article and providing some commentary. I'm not giving any medical advice to anybody. I'm not saying anything anti-vax or anything like that. Anyway, let's see. I very much appreciate this gentleman. This is a gentleman that I would love to sit down and chat with every so often. He and I probably wouldn't necessarily agree on a whole lot of things. I can't tell from this article if he has similar political leanings to mine or not. But yeah, I appreciate this guy, and I think he is unfortunately correct. But I don't think it's just the pandemic that's caused it. I do think it's part of a larger trend. If you caught me on the live with Deb Philman and The Reason We Learn, we talked about this. It's been going for a long time, and even things like Nature have gone off to the point of becoming very unrigorous in support of agendas and narratives, very conflicted ways. So rather than the rigorous part of science and accepting organized skepticism, and if you saw one of the I think it was on the Affirmative Action for Conservatives video, I showed an AGO EOS article where they were talking about where this brave set of authors have written, we have to try and reach out and work with social conservatives, and if we're going to improve diversity in the sciences, and the comments were full of slanders and smears against those particular authors, saying, how can you do that? So there's things like that I'm worried about, is that I think it's more than just pandemic science. I think he's on the right track here. I also think it's more than pandemic science that's taken a hit. I think it is science more broadly that is taking a hit, in that it's forgetting a lot of its own norms. It is forgetting communality and universalism and disinterestedness and organized skepticism. Those four main norms that are so critical, not just to public health science, but to climate science, to psychology, to every number of different fields. And it may be in part just because they're not taught. Like I said, I never learned them in college, and I got my PhD in 2016. I never learned them. Anywhere through college was never taught. I taught myself afterwards. And so that says something with the state of education and who is coming in to be that next generation of young scientists and the training therein that we need to partake in. Again, I cherish all the scientists that I run into, because I think the ones that are really, everyone who's really dedicated. I've met a lot of excellent scientists who are really, really dedicated in doing what they do in the pursuit of the truth and not caring about the narrative, which is what it should be, in my view. The purpose of a scientist, as I've said many times, is the pursuit of the truth. And the zealous pursuit of the truth, with everybody else gut-checking you with the scientific skepticism that is supposed to be there. So I think that's it for me. That's all I have to say, but I do appreciate what this is, and I sure hope that science and its norms don't share the fate of anything disadvantaged in this particular case, although I think in a way they already have, because we don't teach them anymore, either in K through 12 or for science majors in college. Which I'd like to see. If Professor John here teaches them, I applaud you then. Teach them, please. Teach them in your classes. Because they need to be taught. And they need to be taught why they're a good thing. And get students to live by those things and push us who are already in our careers to live by those 4 norms of science. That's it for me. If you like this video, hit the like button on the way out. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel. And of course, check out SciWorthy on Locals at sciworthy.locals.com and become a supporter there. You can connect with me and other scientists and other science enthusiasts and talk over issues like this and more. Also, some strange science news. I'm going to try and look up some strange science news too and do some recording. I'm going to record a few videos and have them scheduled out for next week while I'm on vacation, so you all are not left with nothing from me while I'm gone on vacation. And maybe I'll share some photos and stuff from my vacation. We'll see. I haven't decided yet. But until next time, I'm Adrian signing off. I hope you stay curious.